You're looking to understand the forces shaping our world,
Right.
right? To sort of grasp the big picture without wading through mountains of dense reports.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's exactly what we're trying to do today. We're taking a deep dive into public policy. Think of it as, well, the government's overarching strategies for tackling the big issues we face as a society.
And it's incredibly multifaceted. It's not just about laws being passed. It's
Hmm.
this dynamic system of actions, sometimes inactions, regulations, and how money gets allocated, all intended to address concerns that affect a significant portion of us.
Yeah, like consider the Dakota Access Pipeline issue from a while back.
Oh, definitely.
You had environmental worries bumping up against energy demands,
Yeah,
right? And then questions of tribal sovereignty, even transportation logistics, all tangled up.
exactly.
The project was initially halted, then it moved forward again. It's just a perfect example of how many different pieces are in play when governments try to solve these, well, really complex problems.
And what was really striking about that situation, I think, was how it touched so many different policy areas. It wasn't neatly confined to just one box.
Mm-hmm.
It spilled over.
Right, it's spread out. So our goal today is to really unpack the core ideas of domestic policy using the information we've gathered. We want to give you a solid grasp of what it is, how we can maybe make sense of its different forms,
Hmm.
who the key players are, and, how it all gets funded. We're aiming for those aha moments that stick with you, hopefully without leaving you feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah, make it clear and accessible.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. What exactly is public policy?
Well, at its core, the sort of formal definition is a relatively stable set of purposive governmental actions that address matters of concern to some part of society.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. Relatively stable.
Right. Relatively stable means it's generally long-term direction, not just a quick fix.
Yeah.
And purposive, it's intentional. It's developed through debate, compromise, sometimes stuff that takes years.
Years, okay.
Think about the push to expand healthcare access in the U.S. The Affordable Care Act, the ACA.
Yeah.
That didn't just appear out of thin air in 2010. It was the result of like decades of discussion, learning from state experiments.
Like Massachusetts.
Exactly, like the Romney Plan in Massachusetts. And the reality was, even before the ACA, federal programs were already footing the bill for over half of healthcare spending.
Wow, okay. So it's not just a spur of the moment thing, it's a longer term direction. And it has to be something that affects a lot of us, not just one person getting a special deal.
Precisely. Public policy deals with these broad societal issues. It's different from, say, private bills, which might target very specific individuals or situations.
Gotcha.
And it's really crucial to remember that policy isn't just about what the government does. It also includes what it doesn't do.
How so?
Well, like the ongoing lack of major congressional action on gun safety, for example, despite public opinion polls. Or think about the federal assault weapons ban. It expired back in 2004 simply because lawmakers didn't act to renew it. That inaction is a policy outcome.
Right, right. Sometimes doing nothing is the policy itself. Okay, and when policies do get made, we're talking about actual results, like laws passed by Congress or executive orders from the president, like directing federal agencies on certain practices.
Yeah, or even landmark court rulings.
Yeah.
Think about Brown versus Board of Education ending school segregation. That was a massive policy outcome from the judiciary.
Okay.
And what's fascinating here, too, is the role of the government bureaucracy, the agencies, in actually translating these big policy goals into concrete actions.
How does that work?
So Congress passes something like the Clean Water Act, right? The goal is cleaner water, but it's the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, that has to then develop the specific rules, the standards, the enforcement mechanisms to actually make that happen on the ground.
Okay, so policy. Long-term goals affecting many people includes action and inaction leads to real results managed by agencies. Now, it seems like with any big government action, there are always going to be people who benefit more and maybe others who are, well, less happy about it. Winners and losers.
Oh, absolutely. That's almost inherent in public policy. By its very nature, it often encourages certain behaviors or benefits specific groups, and that can inadvertently disadvantage others.
Even unintentionally.
Yeah, even with the best intentions, policies can have unexpected side effects. For instance, if policy heavily promotes traditional four-year college degrees, that might unintentionally draw students or resources away from valuable vocational and trade schools,
I see.
or efforts to promote diversity in higher education. A positive goal can still create challenges for some applicants based on how they're implemented. Environmental regulations are another classic example. They benefit everyone with cleaner air or water, hopefully, but they can impose significant costs on certain businesses or industries.
Right.
Even something seemingly straightforward like tax breaks for charitable giving could theoretically end up shifting more of the overall tax burden onto lower income folks if wealthier people take more advantage of those deductions.
That point about unintended consequences is really key, isn't it? You try to fix one thing, but might accidentally cause another problem elsewhere. So, with all these different kinds of policies floating around, it can feel pretty complex. Is there a way to sort of categorize them to get a better handle on it all?
Yes, absolutely. There are several useful ways to think about this. One basic dimension is just how politically charged these issues often are. You see very different philosophies, right,
Yeah.
between liberals and conservatives about how much the government should get involved.
Sure, the role of government debate.
Exactly. Then economists often categorize things based on the nature of the goods involved.
Goods, like stuff we buy in a store.
Not quite like that. Economists classify goods based on two main characteristics. First, can you stop people from using it? Is it excludable? And second, is it finite? Is there a limited supply?
Okay, excludable and finite. Give me an example.
So your house, that's a private good. You own it, you can exclude others, and there's only one of it, it's finite. Free market economics really emphasizes these private goods and often argues the market regulates itself best. Libertarians, for instance, generally push for minimal government involvement here.
Makes sense. My house, my rules. But what about things we all kind of share, like the air we breathe?
That's the classic example of a public good. It's generally non-excludable. You can't easily stop your neighbor from breathing the air, and it's essentially infinite, though, of course, we worry a lot about its quality these days. National defense is often cited as another public good.
Okay, public good. Can't exclude. Basically unlimited. What else?
Then you have common goods. These are also non-excludable, but they are finite. Think about fish in the ocean or timber in a forest before it's harvested.
So anyone can fish, but there aren't unlimited fish.
Precisely. And this leads to the famous tragedy of the commons idea. If no one really owns it and everyone can access it, there's a risk of overuse or depletion. That's often why governments step in with regulations on things like fishing quotas or pollution controls for air and water.
Right, to prevent everyone from taking too much. And the last type.
Coal goods. These are potentially open to everyone, but only if they pay a price. So think cable TV, satellite radio, or a private toll road. They're excludable. If you don't pay, you don't get it. But they're often not finite in the same way. One more car on the toll road doesn't usually prevent others.
Okay, private, public, common, toll. That categorization seems helpful. And you mentioned the role of government changing over time.
Oh, absolutely. Historically, especially as the U.S. industrialized, you saw the rise of large corporations, monopolies, and then major crises like the Great Depression. These events really shifted the thinking towards more government regulation and the idea that government should provide certain essential services or safety nets.
So a move away from pure laissez-faire.
Definitely. And building on that, political scientists like Cedar Lowy developed ways to categorize policies based on who bears the costs and who gets the benefits. It's a really useful framework.
Okay, costs and benefits. How does that work?
So first you have distributive policy. Here, the costs are spread widely across the population, think general taxes, but the benefits are concentrated on a smaller, specific group.
Like what?
Classic examples are things like highway construction projects. Everyone pays taxes, but the benefits are more direct for the areas getting the new roads, or for the construction industry. Agricultural subsidies are another one. Pell Grants for college students. Even those huge land grants given to railroad companies back in the 19th century to build the Transcontinental Railroad.
Public land for a private company to build something seen as a national benefit.
Exactly. A more modern example might be the big push to expand broadband internet into rural areas. It's a major infrastructure investment, funded broadly, but benefiting specific communities more directly.
Okay, distributive. Costs spread out, benefits focused. What's next?
Next is regulatory policy. This is kind of the opposite. The costs are concentrated on a specific group or industry, but the benefits are intended to be widely enjoyed by the public.
So like environmental rules.
Perfect example. Regulations on pollution might impose costs on factories, but the goal is cleaner air or water for everyone. Public health and safety rules fall here too. This type of policy really took off during the progressive era, think late 19th, early 20th century.
With the muckrakers.
Exactly. Journalists like Upton Sinclair exposing the horrific conditions in meatpacking plants in the jungle. That led directly to things like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the creation of the FDA. We also saw waves of financial regulation after big economic downturns, like in the 1890s and the 1930s, aimed at controlling monopolies and stabilizing markets.
Right, so the industry pays the cost of compliance, but we all hopefully get safer products or a more stable economy. Makes sense. What's the last type in this framework?
The third type is redistributive policy. This is probably the most politically contentious type. Here, both the costs and the benefits are concentrated, but on different groups. It's essentially about transferring resources from one segment of society to another.
The Robin Hood effect, sometimes called?
That's the idea, yeah. It aims to create greater social or economic equality or provide a basic safety net. Think about programs like Head Start for early childhood education, Medicaid for low-income health care, TANF, which is temporary assistance for needy families, or SNAP, the food stamp program.
Okay.
Even things like tax credits, designed to encourage specific behaviors, like investing in green energy, can be seen as redistributive because they shift resources towards those who engage in that behavior, often funded through the general tax base.
Okay, so we have distributive, regulatory, and redistributive policies. That helps organize things. Now, these policies obviously operate in different subject areas, right? Social issues versus the economy versus education. How do we think about these different sort of policy arenas?
That's right. Policy gets translated into specific programs aimed at different sectors. Social welfare policy is a huge one. It really grew out of the Great Depression and then expanded significantly again in the 1960s during the War on Poverty.
And its main goals.
It generally has two overlapping functions: trying to ensure some level of fairness or equity in a free market system, and creating an economic safety net for people facing hardship, unemployment, disability, old age.
Makes sense. What are the big programs here?
So Social Security is massive. We're talking hundreds of billions a year. It's funded by a dedicated payroll tax that workers and employers pay.
Right, FICA on the pay stub.
Exactly. Originally, back in the 30s, it was designed to address the problems of the industrial age. Older workers unable to work anymore. Widows left without support in cities. Now it has three main parts: retirement benefits, which most people think of.
Yeah.
Disability payments for those who can't work for an extended period. And supplemental security income, or SSI, which provides aid to low-income, aged, blind, or disabled people.
And it's politically sensitive, you mentioned.
Extremely. Especially the retirement part. There's been ongoing debate, particularly heated during the George W. Bush administration, about its long-term solvency. The issue is demographics. The ratio of workers paying in versus retirees drawing benefits has dropped dramatically since the 1950s and is projected to fall further.
So fewer workers supporting more retirees.
Basically, yeah. Proposed solutions often involve things like raising the retirement age further, increasing the payroll tax, or maybe reducing future benefit payouts, but finding political agreement on any of those is really, really tough.
I can imagine. What about healthcare in this arena?
Medicare and Medicaid are the big players. Medicare is the entitlement program primarily for Americans aged 65 and older. It's also funded mainly through payroll taxes. It has different parts covering hospitalization, doctor visits, and outpatient services, and prescription drugs.
And similar funding challenges.
Yes, very similar long-term financial pressures as Social Security, plus the added factor of constantly rising healthcare costs in general. It's a huge budget item.
And Medicaid.
Medicaid is different. It's a program for low-income individuals and families. It's jointly funded by the federal government and the states, and it's formula-based, meaning the federal contribution varies depending on the state's relative wealth. One challenge with Medicaid is that reimbursement rates are often lower, so fewer providers might accept Medicaid patients compared to Medicare or private insurance.
And the ACA affected Medicaid.
Right. The Affordable Care Act aimed to expand Medicaid eligibility significantly by offering states extra federal funding if they raised the income threshold. However, due to a Supreme Court ruling, that expansion became optional for states, and a number of states chose not to expand.
So coverage varies by state. Are there other smaller welfare programs?
Yes, there are several other income support programs, PNF, SNP, unemployment insurance, housing assistance programs that collectively cost hundreds of billions as well, providing crucial support but often subject to debate about eligibility and funding levels.
Okay, that's a lot under the social welfare umbrella. What's another major policy arena?
Science, technology, and education policy is another critical one. After World War II, there was a big focus on reintegrating soldiers into the workforce, and also on building up what President Eisenhower later called the military-industrial complex.
So defense-related tech.
A lot of it, yes. Science and tech policy still heavily benefits the military through research and development, R&D. But there's also significant federal funding for civilian research through agencies like the National Science Foundation, NSF, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, NASA, NOAA,
The weather agency?
right,
Yeah.
the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And there's always this ongoing debate about the right balance between government funding for basic research versus private sector investment, especially in areas like space exploration now with companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin.
NASA versus private companies, yeah. And education policy.
Education policy really has these two main goals: creating a learned citizenry capable of participating in democracy and also providing practical job training for the workforce.
Who's mainly responsible?
Historically, K through 12 education has been primarily a state and local responsibility. The federal government's role has focused more on issues of equity and access, especially in higher education. Think federal student loans, Pell Grants, work-study programs. They also fund job retraining programs and try to funnel resources to disadvantaged K-12 schools or support non-traditional programs like charter schools.
So federal involvement is more about leveling the playing field in specific initiatives. What about policy directed at businesses?
Right. Business stimulus and regulation. This is a constant balancing act for the government. On one hand, they want to promote economic growth, encourage businesses to invest and create jobs.
Stimulus, subsidies.
Exactly. There's significant government aid, especially to industries like agriculture and energy. Subsidies help cover risks, ensure profitability, think about supports for stable crops, or, controversially, ethanol subsidies.
Right, the ethanol debate.
But on the other hand, the government also has a responsibility to protect consumers, workers, and the environment from potential negative consequences of business activity.
Ready?
Precisely. That's where you get federal regulatory agencies like OSHA, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, focusing on worker safety, the FDA ensuring food and drug safety, the Bureau of Consumer Protection within the FTC looking out for consumers, and the EPA setting environmental standards, plus many others focused on specific industries like banking or communications.
Okay, so we've got these arenas: social welfare, science tech, business stimulus regulation. Now, who are the actual people driving these policies? It can't just be the president and Congress signing bills, right?
No, definitely not. It's a much wider cast of characters. Broadly, you could think about policy advocates and policy analysts.
Advocates versus analysts. What's the difference?
Policy advocates have a particular viewpoint, a normative position. They believe certain policies should be enacted or maintained, and they work actively lobbying, mobilizing public opinion to achieve that goal.
Like interest groups.
Exactly. Think of groups like AARP, the big organization for older Americans. They lobby intensely on things like protecting Social Security and lowering healthcare costs for seniors.
And they can be pretty influential.
Hugely influential. There's an interesting example where AARP actually supported the Republican-led Medicare prescription drug plan back in 2002. It wasn't maybe everything they wanted, but they made a strategic calculation that it was the best chance to get something passed for their members. Other groups, maybe focused more on moral or justice issues, might be less willing to compromise like that.
So advocates push for specific outcomes. What about analysts?
Policy analysts aim to be more objective. Their job is to evaluate different policy options and assess their likely impacts, the costs, the benefits, the potential unintended consequences. They provide information to help decision makers choose.
So they crunch the numbers, run the models.
Kind of, yeah. But it's important to remember that policy analysis itself can be political. Advocates often use analysis or commission their own, framing the costs and benefits in ways that support their preferred policy.
So you have to look at who funded the analysis.
It definitely helps. You have think tanks across the political spectrum, like the Libertarian Cato Institute or the more liberal Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, doing analysis with a certain perspective. That's why institutions that strive for impartiality are important.
Like who?
Well, within government, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, is highly respected for providing nonpartisan analyses of the budgetary and economic effects of proposed legislation. Congress relies heavily on their scores.
So the CBO says how much a bill will cost.
Essentially, yes, among other things. Executive branch agencies also do their own analysis. The EPA analyzes environmental impacts, OSHA looks at workplace safety impacts, and so on. Although the White House's Office of Management and Budget, OMB, also reviews agency analyses, and its role is partly to ensure alignment with the president's priorities, which can sometimes introduce a political element even there.
Okay, so lots of different players, advocates pushing, analysts assessing with varying degrees of objectivity. Is there a typical life cycle or process that a policy goes through?
Well, it's often messy, but political scientists usually describe a sort of four-stage model. It's not always perfectly linear, but it's a helpful way to think about it.
Okay, what are the stages?
First is agenda setting. This is where a problem gets identified and gains attention from the public and policymakers. How the problem is framed, like is healthcare an access issue, a cost issue, a quality issue, is really crucial here,
Framing matters.
hugely. This stage also involves developing potential solutions or alternatives. Think about childhood obesity solutions. Could range from more PE in schools to changing school lunch menus to taxing sugary drinks. Agenda setting kind of ends when a specific problem and a potential solution get paired up and are ready to be seriously considered.
And getting on the agenda can take time.
Oh yeah. Think about acid rain. Scientists knew about it for a long time, but it took years of advocacy and growing public awareness before it became a major item on the policy agenda, leading to action in the 1990s.
Okay, stage one. Get the problem and a solution onto the agenda. What's next?
Stage 2 is policy enactment. This is probably the most visible stage. It's where the elected branches, Congress, the president debate, potentially amend, and ultimately vote on whether to turn that proposed solution into law or formal policy.
The bill becomes a law, hopefully.
Right. Or an executive order is issued,
Yeah.
or a major regulation is finalized. Stage 3 is policy implementation. The law is passed. Now what? Government agencies have to actually carry it out.
Putting it into practice.
Exactly. And this can happen in different ways. Sometimes it's very top-down, with detailed instructions from the federal level. Other times it's more bottom-up, giving state and local governments or even street-level bureaucrats more discretion in how they implement the policy based on local conditions.
Okay, enacted, then implemented. What's the final stage?
Evaluation. Did the policy actually work? Did it achieve its intended goals? Did it have those unintended consequences we talked about?
Measuring the results.
Yes. An evaluation can sometimes yield surprising results. Some studies, for instance, suggested certain popular abstinence-only sex education programs didn't actually reduce and maybe even increase teen pregnancy rates compared to comprehensive programs. Or the early DARE anti-drug program, its effectiveness was really questioned when compared rigorously to control groups.
So evaluation is crucial for learning what works.
Absolutely. The findings from evaluation should ideally feed back into the process, maybe leading to adjustments in implementation or even pushing the issue back onto the agenda for rethinking. It creates a kind of policy cycle.
Identify, enact, implement, evaluate, and repeat. Okay. No, none of this happens without money. How does the government actually decide what to spend money on, and where does that money come from? Let's get into budgeting and tax policy.
Right. A country's budget is, in many ways, a statement of its values and priorities. Where the money goes tells you a lot. And we're talking big numbers. The federal budget in 2020 was over $6.5 trillion.
Wow. And how do they approach managing the economy overall? Are there different philosophies?
Oh, definitely. Broadly speaking, before the Great Depression in the 1930s, the dominant view was laissez-faire economics, basically, hands-off. The idea was that private markets are efficient and the economy naturally goes through cycles of growth and contraction, and the government shouldn't interfere much.
Let the market sort it out.
Pretty much. But the Depression shattered that consensus. Keynesian economics became much more influential. John Maynard Keynes argued that government spending is crucial, especially during deep recessions, to boost demand and get the economy going again.
How does that work?
The government spends money maybe on infrastructure projects or through things like unemployment benefits or retirement payments, which puts money in people's pockets, increasing consumption. Tax cuts or incentives can also stimulate demand. The idea is the government steps in to smooth out the business cycle, then maybe pulls back and repays debt when the economy recovers.
Okay, Keynesian. Use government spending to manage demand. What else?
Starting more in the 1970s, supply-side economics gained traction. This approach focuses on the productive capacity of the economy, the supply side. The argument here is that high taxes and heavy regulation stifle investment and discourage work, slowing growth.
So cut taxes and regulations.
That's the main prescription, yeah. Reduce taxes, particularly on businesses and investors, and ease regulations with the expectation that this will incentivize production, leading to more jobs and overall growth.
So different economic theories driving budget decisions. How is the actual federal budget structured?
It's primarily divided into two big categories: mandatory spending and discretionary spending.
Mandatory versus discretionary. What's the difference?
Mandatory spending includes programs where the funding is basically set by existing law based on eligibility criteria or formulas. It doesn't require Congress to pass a new appropriations bill each year.
Like Social Security.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are the big entitlement programs that fall under mandatory spending. It also includes things like benefits for retired federal employees and veterans. In 2020, this made up around 71% of the federal budget, the vast majority.
Wow, over two-thirds is essentially on autopilot.
Largely determined by prior laws, yes.
Yeah.
Keynesians tend to like these programs because they act as automatic stabilizers. Spending goes up during recessions as more people qualify for unemployment or other benefits, helping to maintain overall demand.
Okay, that's mandatory. What's discretionary?
Discretionary spending is the part that Congress does have to actively approve through annual appropriations bills. This covers the funding for most federal agencies, running the government, science and technology investments, foreign affairs, education programs, transportation projects, some redistributive benefits, and significantly, the military budget.
So the defense budget is discretionary.
Yes, after Social Security, the military is the largest single component of federal spending, and it falls under the discretionary category that Congress debates each year.
Okay, so most spending is mandatory. The rest is discretionary and subject to annual fights. What happens when spending is more than the money coming in?
That creates a deficit for that specific year, the annual shortfall. The national debt is the accumulation of all past deficits minus any surpluses. It's the total amount the government owes.
And that debt number is huge, right?
Yeah, it was around $19 trillion back in 2015 and surpassed $22 trillion by March 2021, and it's continued to climb.
Why is it so hard to balance the budget then?
Well, it's politically very difficult. Cutting popular discretionary programs is hard. Nobody wants cuts to their local projects or favorite agencies. And making changes to the big mandatory entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare is even harder, often called the third rail of politics. Touch it and you die, politically speaking.
Because so many people rely on them.
Exactly. So balancing the budget often involves politically painful choices that lawmakers are reluctant to make.
Okay, so that's the spending side. How does the government actually get the revenue? Tax policy.
Right. The main goal of tax policy is, obviously, to raise enough money effectively, but ideally without messing up other policy goals, like economic growth or fairness.
Are there different kinds of taxes?
Yes. A key distinction is between progressive and regressive taxes. Progressive taxes are those where people with higher incomes pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes. The federal income tax, with its brackets, is designed to be progressive.
Higher income, higher rate.
Generally, yes. Though tax laws like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 shifted those brackets and lowered the top rate. Still, the principle is progressive. Keynesians often favor progressive taxes for fairness and because higher earners can afford to pay more.
And regressive.
Regressive taxes are those where lower-income individuals end up paying a larger percentage of their income. It might be a flat amount or a tax on consumption. Think about excise taxes, taxes on specific goods like gasoline, alcohol, tobacco.
Sin taxes.
Right. Lower-income people might spend a larger portion of their budget on these goods, so the tax hits them harder as a percentage of income. The payroll tax that funds Social Security is also considered regressive because it only applies up to a certain income level, $118,500 in the example year. So billionaires pay the same dollar amount as someone earning that cap. Supply-siders sometimes favor flatter or more regressive taxes, arguing they interfere less with incentives to earn more.
Interesting. So where does most federal money actually come from?
In 2020, the biggest chunk came from individual income taxes, about 47%. Payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare were next, a big chunk at 38.3%. Corporate income taxes were much smaller, only about 6.2%. Excise taxes were around 2.5%, and the rest came from various other sources.
So individuals pay the lion's share through income and payroll taxes.
Yes, and it's worth noting that after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act lowered corporate taxes, the federal deficit widened, highlighting the direct link between tax policy and the budget balance.
Okay. One more big player in the economic policy world we should probably mention is the Federal Reserve, right? The Fed.
Absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
The Fed was created way back in 1913, largely because the country kept having these disruptive financial panics. It's the central bank of the U.S.
And what does it do?
Its original goals were pretty clear: maximum employment, stable prices, meaning low inflation, and moderate long-term interest rates. Today, its role is even broader. It conducts monetary policy, basically managing the money supply and interest rates, supervises banks, and helps maintain the stability of the financial system.
Who runs the Fed?
It's overseen by a board of governors, 7 members appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They serve long, staggered 14-year terms designed to insulate them from short-term political pressure. The chair and vice chair serve shorter 4-year terms within that.
And they set interest rates.
The key decisions on monetary policy, including setting target interest rates, are made by the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, which includes the Board of Governors plus 5 presidents of the regional Federal Reserve banks. There are 12 regional Fed banks across the country that handle operational aspects.
And the Fed chair is really influential.
Immensely. Think Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell. Their decisions and even just their public statements can move global markets. Greenspan's actions during the 1987 stock market crash were widely praised, though some also argue his policy of keeping interest rates low in the early 2000s contributed to the housing bubble and the 2008 financial crisis.
It's a tough job.
Definitely. They have that dual mandate, keep inflation low and keep unemployment low. But sometimes policies that help one might hurt the other, so it's a constant balancing act. And it leads to that critical thinking question from our source material. Should this much power over the economy rest with unelected appointees serving long terms, or should it be somehow more accountable to elected leaders? There are strong arguments on both sides.
That's a really fundamental question about economic governance. So wrapping this all up, we've covered a lot of ground on public policy. It's clearly this complex, long-term process.
Definitely not so.
Involving government actions and inactions aimed at societal concerns. We've looked at different ways to categorize policies, distributive, regulatory, redistributive, and different arenas where they play out, like social welfare, science, business. We talked about the key players, the advocates pushing, the analysts assessing, and the typical stages from getting an issue on the agenda through enactment, implementation, and finally evaluation.
That whole policy cycle.
Right. And underpinning it all is the complex world of budgeting and tax policy shaped by different economic philosophies, the split between mandatory and discretionary spending, and the powerful role of the Federal Reserve. It's much more than just laws on paper.
Absolutely. And hopefully, getting a handle on these core concepts gives you, the listener, a kind of shortcut, a better framework for understanding the news and the debates about government action that you hear every day.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe one final thought to leave you with, building on what we discussed. Think back to those different types of goods we talked about near the beginning: private, public, common, and toll goods.
Right. The excludable finite distinctions.
How does classifying something, say, healthcare or internet access, or maybe even clean energy as one type of good versus another, actually influence the kinds of policy solutions we propose and debate? What are the real-world implications when we argue about whether something should be treated more like a public good available to all versus a private commodity bought and sold in the market? It really shapes the entire conversation, doesn't it?
It really does. Definitely something to mull over.